Hey everyone, it's Gabrielle Meyer here. I'm going to read an excerpt from my book, A Home for Her Baby. It's my February new release from Love Inspired, and I want to thank Tony Shiloh for asking me to do this today. I thought that I would read from the first chapter. It's where we meet the hero and where the story kind of gets set up, and so you'll know kind of what's going to happen later on. Max Evans stepped out of his Lexus and stared up at the large Warren House bed and breakfast. When he left Timber Falls 10 years ago, he never imagined he'd be back. The truth was, he had hoped he wouldn't have to return, at least not this soon. Coming back meant he'd failed, and failure was not an option, at least not for an Evans man. But Max didn't like who he'd become, and it was easy to pinpoint when it all started to go wrong. Maybe by coming back to where he took a wrong turn, he could backtrack and make a better choice this time. The day was hot for the beginning of September, and he had been driving for 2 days from Buffalo, New York. All he wanted was a shower and a place to crash inside the air-conditioned house, though he wasn't sure it would be quite so easy. There were still a lot of details he needed to oversee before he could sleep. He went to the back of his Lexus and took out his large suitcase. He'd leave the rest inside the trunk and deal with it later. Max Evans? A boy asked from a neighboring yard. He and his friends were tossing a football, but all of them stopped to stare at Max. "Whoa," said another, "you are Max Evans." Max smiled but didn't encourage the boys to come over to say hi. He'd have to get used to the attention being back in his hometown, but right now he needed some rest. "Is it true you quit?" asked a third boy. "If I was in the NFL, I wouldn't quit." Max didn't want to encourage them, but he couldn't ignore them either. "I retired," he said. After playing in the NFL for 6 years, he'd been traded 4 times and suffered 2 serious injuries. The last one had been a concussion, shortly followed by talk of another trade. Max decided to retire before he was dropped and before he had another injury. "Are you staying there?" asked the first boy, pointing at the bed and breakfast. Max glanced up at the massive house again and let the truth sink in. "I own this place." "You're my neighbor?" asked the second boy. "Whoa," he said again. "I'm going to tell my mom." The boys took off toward the house, calling out to the boy's mom as they ran. Max wondered if he knew who she was. Would she be happy to know that Max was next door, or would she forbid her son from talking to him? He didn't usually care what the public thought about him, but it was different in Timber Falls, Minnesota. Here, his friends and neighbors were more like family, and he'd always cared what his family thought about him. It had almost destroyed him when he messed up and disappointed his dad and the whole town 10 years ago, the night before the championship game. If he could go back, he would have said no to the college party, no to the alcohol, and especially the girl. He owed the town a state football championship title, which was the reason he'd chosen to finally return. The high school team needed a head football coach, and with his recent retirement, he had all the time in the world. The school agreed to keep the news of his coaching job a secret until his arrival to prevent undue attention on the student players. Max didn't want them to have to deal with the publicity before he could be there to shoulder the burden for them. The boys from next door were still loud enough to hear as Max walked up the sidewalk toward the house, a smile on his face. The whole neighborhood was like a page out of a Norman Rockwell calendar. Mature trees stretched over 3rd Street, their branches intertwining with the ones across the road. Up and down the street, Victorian-era homes graced the historic neighborhood. Each was painted in unique colors, boasting large windows, turrets, and wraparound porches. But it was the Warren house that was a crown jewel, though it hadn't always been this pretty. Max remembered the house from his childhood. It had been run down and abandoned for as long as he could remember. He had ridden his bike past it almost every day on the way to Piper Pearson's house. Just thinking about Piper made the smile disappear from Max's face. She had been the one person in the world who knew him better than he knew himself, and the girl he thought he'd marry. Now she was the woman who probably despised him more than any other. In a town as small as Timber Falls, it would be impossible to avoid her. The likelihood of seeing her again was the one thing that had made Max hesitate to return. He'd hurt her more than anyone else that fateful night, and she'd be the hardest person to face. But he couldn't run away forever. At least, that's what he kept telling himself. It was the only way to convince himself to come back to town. Home for Her Baby, like I said, my February new release from Love Inspired. Hope you enjoyed this, and thanks again, Tony, for having me.